We often assume that the loudest voice in the room belongs to the person who has most carefully considered the facts. This instinctual trust in confidence is one of the most persistent illusions of our social lives, masking a deeper psychological reality. What if the very boldness we admire is actually a structural bypass for the difficult work of genuine, complex thought? Consider the last time you watched someone deliver an opinion with such unwavering force that you briefly questioned your own memory. They speak without the hesitation that usually accompanies deep analysis, projecting a reality that feels entirely solid and impressively unshakable. There is a peculiar tension when a person defends a position they haven't actually explored, yet they cling to it like a raft. It is a common human experience to encounter those who use language not to reveal truth, but to signal an unearned status. The gap between a person's perceived intellect and their actual cognitive engagement is a chasm filled with fascinating psychological artifacts and maneuvers. Why is it that those who know the least often seem the most convinced of their own absolute and unwavering authority? This phenomenon is not merely a social annoyance. It is a fundamental window into the mechanics of the human ego and shells. Arthur Schopenhauer once remarked that every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. This observation points to a hidden psychological mechanism where the absence of thought is not experienced as a vacuum, but as completion. When the mind stops questioning, it does not feel empty. Instead, it feels satisfied with the shallowest possible explanation of reality. We are entering a realm where the unaware person is not someone lacking information, but someone lacking the tools to process it. Observers of human nature, philosophers, and psychologists have long noticed this pattern of intellectual rigidity appearing as a form of armor. Intellectual humility is the first casualty of a mind that has prioritized social survival and ego preservation over the pursuit of truth. Carl Jung suggested that thinking is difficult, which is precisely why most people choose to judge instead of engaging in analysis. Judgment provides an immediate conclusion, a resting place for the brain that requires far less caloric energy than the sustained effort of doubt. The patterns we observe are the footprints of a mind that has retreated into the safety of prepackaged ideas and emotional reactions. Understanding these quiet exposures is like learning a new language, where the pauses and the cliches tell a much larger story. By identifying these markers, we can begin to see the invisible architecture of human thought and the scaffolding that supports its absence. At the core of this behavior lies a phenomenon often referred to in modern psychology as the Dunning-Kruger effect. It describes a cognitive bias where people with low ability at a task overestimate their competence because they lack metacognitive skills. To know that you do not know requires a certain level of knowledge, a baseline that allows you to see boundaries. Without that baseline, the individual is trapped in a loop where their own incompetence shields them from the realization of their lack. Daniel Kahneman, in his work on thinking systems, explains how our brains prefer the fast track of intuition over slow logic. The fast system thrives on patterns, stories, and ease, while the slow system requires deliberate, often painful, mental labor and concentration. Unaware people often operate entirely within the fast system, accepting the first plausible-sounding thought as an objective and unshakable universal truth. This reliance on mental shortcuts creates a false sense of fluency, where the ease of recalling a slogan is mistaken for understanding. When a person stops thinking, they begin to rely on availability heuristics, favoring information that is most recent or emotionally charged. The ego plays a massive role here, acting as a specialized security guard that filters out any information causing cognitive dissonance. To admit a lack of understanding is to admit a vulnerability, and for many, the ego perceives this as a threat. Therefore, the mind constructs a shell of certainty that protects the individual from the terrifying possibility that they might be uninformed. This shell is not made of facts, but of emotional convictions and social reinforcements that prioritize belonging over objective truth pursuit. Nietzsche observed that people will often cling to a conviction even when proven false because it provides a sense of stable orientation. The lack of thinking is not a passive state. It is an active avoidance of the complexity defining our multifaceted existence. It is a retreat into the binary, where things are either good or evil, right or wrong, leaving no room for gray. In the modern world, this lack of thinking often manifests as the rehearsed opinion, where individuals repeat phrases heard elsewhere. You might notice this in a professional setting when a colleague uses buzzwords to mask a fundamental misunderstanding of core goals. They speak in circles, using the vocabulary of expertise as a cloak, hoping the aesthetic of intelligence will substitute for substance. In social circles, this appears as the person who is never wrong, turning every disagreement into a battle of the wills. These individuals often interrupt others, not because they have a counterpoint, but because they are waiting to reassert their static position. The digital age has exacerbated this, as social media rewards the quick, the bold, and the simplistic over the deeply considered. People now curate their intellectual identities by sharing headlines they haven't read, distancing their public persona from actual internal cognitive processing. In relationships, a lack of thinking shows up as a refusal to consider perspectives, as doing so would require mental flexibility. Instead of curious inquiry, the unaware person offers platitudes, generic advice that sounds wise but fails to address specific and complex problems. This reliance on clichés is a subtle exposure, signaling that the speaker has reached the end of their mental runway. They use thought-terminating clichés, phrases like "it is what it is," to shut down deeper exploration of problems requiring real effort. Observe how they react to ambiguity. The unaware mind finds the unknown to be an enemy that must be conquered immediately. They rarely ask questions that begin with why or how, preferring instead to make declarations that begin with obviously or everyone. This performative certainty is a mask for a deep-seated fear of being seen as intellectually inadequate or socially disconnected from peers. It is a quiet tragedy, as the person believes they are projecting strength, while observers see the rigid fragility of minds. Deeper still, we find that unawareness is often characterized by a lack of narrative complexity in how one views personal history. The unaware person tells a story of their life where they are always the hero or victim, never the complex antagonist. They lack what psychologists call integrative complexity, the ability to recognize multiple perspectives and synthesize them into a coherent, nuanced whole. Marcus Aurelius noted that everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not truth. The individual who has stopped thinking treats their own perspective as the only possible reality, effectively closing the doors to growth. This leads to a pattern of confabulation, where the brain invents reasons for its actions after the fact to maintain illusions. They aren't lying to you. They are lying to themselves, and you are simply a witness to the internal fabrication. This process is often signaled by an over-reliance on categorical thinking, placing people and ideas into boxes that never open. When you challenge one of these boxes, the reaction is often emotional rather than logical because you are challenging their safety. They might use ad hominem attacks, focusing on your character rather than your argument, because their mind cannot process the argument. Another layer is the curse of knowledge in reverse, where they assume understanding a detail means they understand the system. They mistake familiarity for mastery, believing that because they have heard of a concept, they have integrated its profound implications. This leads to a static worldview where no new information is allowed to change the map, regardless of how outdated. Robert Greene points out that the greatest power comes from being able to see things as they are, not as wishes. Unaware people are constantly viewing the world through the lens of their wishes, fears, and biases, never cleaning the glass. They are often the most susceptible to groupthink, adopting the opinions of their tribe to avoid the loneliness of independent thought. The lack of thinking is quietly exposed when someone cannot explain why they believe something beyond stating it is common sense. They become a mirror of their environment rather than a source of original light, reflecting whatever ideas happen to be dominant. The most brutal realization is that this lack of thinking is not a sign of a broken brain, but evolved. Our biological ancestors didn't always need to be right about the cosmos. They needed to be part of a tribe. The human mind is primarily designed for survival and social cohesion, not for the objective pursuit of abstract or uncomfortable truths. Therefore, the person who seems unaware is often someone whose survival mechanisms are perpetually stuck in the on position, blocking. They are not intentionally trying to be ignorant. They are emotionally unable to handle the instability that comes with transformative doubt. Doubt is a high-level cognitive state that requires a secure sense of self to navigate without falling into paralyzing anxiety. When the self is fragile, certainty becomes a psychological necessity, a wall built to keep the chaos at a distance. The tragedy is that the more someone hides behind this wall, the more they lose touch with reality that helps growth. They become trapped in a cognitive feedback loop where they only seek out information that confirms their existing and biased beliefs. This is why arguing with an unaware person is often futile. You aren't fighting their logic, but their sense of self-preservation. Their lack of thinking is a protective armor, and your attempts to introduce nuance are perceived as an attempt at stripping. The realization that we are all, at times, that person is the beginning of maturity and the end of intellectual arrogance. It is easy to point out the lack of thinking in others, but it is much harder to see gaps. We all have blind spots, Areas of our lives where we have stopped asking questions and started accepting the first comfortable answer. Think of a topic you feel strongly about. Can you accurately describe the strongest possible argument for the opposing side's view? If you cannot, you may be experiencing the very lack of thinking that you find so frustrating in other people. Every time we reach for a cliché instead of a considered thought, we are quietly exposing our own mental fatigue. Reflect on the last time you were proven wrong. Did you feel a sense of curiosity or a flash of anger? That anger is the signal that your ego has stepped in to replace your intellect, marking the exact moment thinking ceased. The goal is not to be a perfect thinker, as such a thing does not exist, but to be aware. The antidote to this quiet exposure is the cultivation of radical curiosity, the habit of asking why, especially when answers seem. It requires the courage to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, resisting the urge to reach for a shallow label. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less, allowing the world to exist without your judgment. When we practice intellectual honesty, we become more aware of the shortcuts our minds take, and we can choose longer paths. This shift changes how we speak, moving us away from declarations of certainty and toward the collaborative exploration of life's mysteries. By recognizing the patterns of unawareness in ourselves, we develop a deeper empathy for others who are still trapped in shells. In the end, the quiet exposure of a lack of thinking is a reminder of our shared struggle to make sense. The path to wisdom is not paved with the bricks of certainty, but with the stones of persistent, humble, and inquiry. If we can learn to value the process of thinking over the comfort of being right, we open ourselves up. True intelligence is not found in having all the answers, but in having the resilience to keep asking the right questions.